December 23, 1944. 6,000 feet over the Ardennes. A sky that had been locked in cloud and freezing fog for 7 straight days had finally cracked open. 241 unarmored transport planes emerged from that gap in the overcast. They flew in tight formation, low and slow, over the snow-covered forests of southern Belgium. Their holds were packed with ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and artillery shells. Below them, surrounded on every side, was a small Belgian crossroads town, whose name would become one of the most recognized words of the entire war. Bastogne. On the ground, inside a ring of German steel, General Major Heinz Cocotte watched those planes appear through the grey winter sky. He commanded the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, the unit that had done more than any other to tighten the noose around the town. He watched parachutes blossom in their hundreds, multicolored canopies drifting down through the cold air, and for a long, frozen moment, he believed he was watching fresh American paratroopers arriving to reinforce the defenders. He was wrong. What he was actually witnessing was something the Wehrmacht had no framework to understand. Not a tactical movement, not a battlefield maneuver, but the full, terrifying weight of American industrial and logistical power delivered through the air to a surrounded town on 12 hours' notice. This is the story of how a country that had mass-produced a brand-new wonder drug in a converted ice factory in Brooklyn managed to fly a vial of that drug into a besieged Belgian town on Christmas night, and why the Germans who surrounded that town could not believe what they were seeing. To understand what happened at Bastogne, you need to understand what was supposed to happen to the entire Western Front in the winter of 1944. By December of that year, the war was entering what the Allies believed was its final phase. Paris had been liberated. The Low Countries were largely free. Allied armies stood at the German border along much of its length. In the Pacific, American forces were island-hopping toward the Japanese home islands. In Italy, the front had ground northward through years of brutal mountain fighting. Everywhere the Axis was retreating. Adolf Hitler did not see it that way. He had been secretly planning an enormous counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the same densely wooded, deeply ridged terrain through which German armour had burst in May of 1940, knifing through Allied lines and reaching the English Channel coast in under 2 weeks. He believed he could do it again. He would split the American and British armies, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Soviets reached Berlin. The plan was called Operation Watch on the Rhine. It would be the largest German offensive on the Western Front since the fall of France. 3 armies, roughly 250,000 soldiers, and nearly 1,400 armoured fighting vehicles, massed in secret behind the Siegfried Line. It opened at 0530 hours on December 16, 1944, with a thunderous artillery barrage along a front stretching roughly 80 miles through the Belgian and Luxembourg Ardennes. The weather had been deliberately chosen. Low cloud and dense fog grounded Allied air power. American lines in the Ardennes were thinly held, manned partly by exhausted divisions pulled back to rest, and partly by green divisions just arriving in the theatre. The shock was immediate and catastrophic. American units were overrun, encircled, or simply swept aside. The vital road junction of St. Vith fell after desperate resistance. Thousands of American soldiers were captured in the first 48 hours. The front buckled inward like a fist punching through paper. On maps in London and Washington, the shape of that fist gave the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. At the centre of what the Germans needed to capture, sitting at the junction of 7 major roads through the Ardennes, was Bastogne. Bastogne was not a fortress. It was a market town. Its stone houses and narrow streets had stood for centuries, and in peacetime it served the farms and villages of the surrounding Belgian countryside. But in war, those 7 roads made it something else entirely. Control Bastogne, and you controlled movement through the entire southern Ardennes. Without it, German supply lines pushing westward would be permanently strangled. The town had to be taken quickly, or the entire offensive would stall. General Heinrich von Luttwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps, the German force assigned to take Bastogne. He had at his disposal Panzer Lehr Division under General Fritz Bayerlein, the 2nd Panzer Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division under Cocotte. Together they represented some of the most experienced armoured and infantry forces the Wehrmacht could field in December of 1944. They outnumbered the defenders inside Bastogne by roughly 5-1. What stood in their way was the American 101st Airborne Division. The 101st had not jumped into Bastogne. It had ridden there in open trucks, at night, in sleet and freezing rain, covering 107 miles in less than 24 hours, from its rest camp at Mourmelon-le-Grand, southeast of Reims. The 82nd Airborne Division, refitting at camps near Sisson and Suippes, was simultaneously diverted north to plug the gap on the upper shoulder of the breakthrough. The 101st was going to Bastogne. The division was between commanders. Its regular commanding general, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington attending a conference when the offensive began. The acting commander was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's artillery chief, a quiet, direct man who had been with the division since its formation. The paratroopers arrived at Bastogne on December 18, 1944, just ahead of the German advance. Many had left their rest camps with little more than what they were wearing. Ammunition was short, winter clothing was inadequate, medical supplies were whatever each man carried. They drove toward the sound of the guns and were told to hold. They were not alone. Alongside the 101st came Combat Command Baker of the 10th Armored Division, under Colonel William Roberts. Roberts deployed his armor in 3 separate teams east and northeast of the town to buy time for the paratroopers to organize their defenses. Those teams fought brutal delaying actions that proved essential. At the village of Neuville, Major William de Sobry's armored force fought alongside the 1st Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Leprade. Together they held off repeated attacks by the 2nd Panzer Division through December 19th and into the 20th. Leprade was killed by an artillery shell that struck the joint command post. De Sobry was wounded in the same blast. But they bought hours that could not be replaced. By the night of December 20th, 1944, the Germans had closed the ring. The last road out of Bastogne, the route southwest toward Neufchâteau, was cut at 11:30 that evening. The town was encircled. Roughly 18,000 American soldiers and several thousand Belgian civilians were now trapped inside a perimeter of roughly 5 miles, surrounded by forces that expected to crush them within days. The Americans inside Bastogne woke on December 21, 1944, to a situation that looked, on paper, impossible. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. In some batteries, it was less. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, one of the most aggressive units in the perimeter, reached a point where it had only 9 rounds of high-explosive ammunition remaining. Riflemen counted their magazines. Tankers saved every shell for the clearest possible shot. The town's Belgian population sheltered in cellars as German artillery searched the streets above them. The medical situation was in some ways worse than the ammunition problem, because it had already been decided by a single catastrophic event 2 days earlier. On the night of December 19th and into the early hours of December 20th, a German armored column moving southwest through the darkness overran the 326th Airborne Medical Company's clearing station near Herbaimont, 8 miles from Bastogne. The attack came at approximately 22:30 hours on December 19th. Within 15 minutes of machine gun fire from the half-tracks, the station was in German hands. 11 officers and 119 enlisted men were taken prisoner. Among the captured was Lieutenant Colonel David Gold, the division surgeon, along with most of the division's second-echelon surgical capability. Inside Bastogne, the surviving senior medical officer was Major William Barfield, the 326th's commanding officer, who now served as acting division surgeon. He had 2 dental officers, a handful of administrative medical officers, and roughly 113 enlisted medics drawn from multiple units. He assembled them into an improvised clearing station, gathering anyone with medical training from engineer, artillery, and anti-aircraft units, and set to work. A second aid station operated nearby on the Rue Neufchâteau, run by Captain Jack Pryor, the surgeon for Combat Command Baker of the 10th Armored. Pryor worked from a requisitioned building with a riding hall used as an annex, receiving the wounded from the armored force. Both stations operated with what they had, which was never enough. The single item that could not be improvised, and that the local supply depots in Bastogne did not carry, was penicillin. Penicillin in December of 1944 was barely a year old as a mass-produced medicine. Most people alive at the time had never encountered it. The soldiers lying on stretchers in improvised aid stations likely knew it only as something the army had started, including in medical kits that year, a pale yellow powder in a glass vial, said to fight infection in ways that nothing had reliably fought infection before. The story of penicillin begins with a British scientist named Alexander Fleming, who in 1928 noticed that a mold contaminating one of his Petri dishes had killed the bacteria around it. The mold was Penicillium notatum. He named the active substance it produced penicillin, published his findings, and noted its remarkable antibacterial properties. But he could not isolate it in usable quantities, and the work was set aside. It lay dormant for more than a decade, its potential sitting untouched in the scientific literature, while soldiers in every conflict fought and died from wound infections that penicillin could have cured. It was Howard Florey, an Australian pathologist working at Oxford, who revived the work in 1940, alongside the German refugee biochemist Ernst Chain and the British scientist Norman Heatley. They succeeded in purifying a small quantity of penicillin and tested it on 8 mice infected with lethal doses of streptococcal bacteria. 4 received penicillin, 4 did not. By the next morning, the 4 untreated mice were dead. The 4 treated mice were alive. Florey and his team knew they had something extraordinary. The problem was scale. Producing enough penicillin to treat even a single human patient required growing the mold across hundreds of laboratory dishes simultaneously, extracting tiny quantities of active compound from each one, and pooling the results in a process that was slow, fragile, and utterly unsuited to mass production. The first American patient saved by penicillin was a woman named Ann Miller, treated at New Haven Hospital in March of 1942. She had been dying of a blood infection following a miscarriage. Her temperature had been elevated for weeks. A small quantity of penicillin, obtained with considerable difficulty through research channels, brought her fever down within hours. She recovered completely and lived to the age of 90. But treating one patient and treating tens of thousands of wounded soldiers on multiple continents were entirely different problems. The quantities needed were staggering, and the early production methods yielded almost nothing. By the middle of 1943, all the penicillin available to Allied forces combined was enough to treat only a handful of patients in the entire North African theater. What changed everything was a single building in Brooklyn, New York. Pfizer, at the time a mid-sized chemical manufacturer, had been developing fermentation processes since the 1920s. In September of 1943, the company purchased a derelict ice plant on Marcy Avenue in Brooklyn and began converting it into a penicillin production facility. The key to the whole operation was a technique called deep tank fermentation, developed by researchers at the United States Department of Agriculture's laboratory in Peoria, Illinois, using corn steep liquor as the nutrient base for the penicillin mold. On March 1, 1944, the Pfizer plant on Marcy Avenue opened. It contained 14 fermentation tanks, each holding 7,500 gallons. The scale was unlike anything attempted in biology before. Within months, the plant was producing more penicillin in a single month than had existed anywhere in the world throughout all of 1943. American penicillin production rose from 21 billion units across the entirety of 1943 to 1,663 billion units across 1944. By the time Allied forces landed at Normandy in June of 1944, Pfizer alone was producing roughly 90% of all the penicillin available to Allied forces on D-Day. Howard Florey, the Oxford scientist who had first proven the drug's power, later put it plainly. Had it not been for that effort, he said, there would certainly not have been sufficient penicillin by D-Day to treat all severe casualties, both British and American. What penicillin did on the battlefield was transform the relationship between a wound and death. In 1914, more than 12% of all wounded British soldiers developed gas gangrene, the catastrophic bacterial infection of muscle tissue that turned wounds black, required emergency amputation, and still frequently killed. By 1918, aggressive surgical cleaning alone had already brought that rate down to roughly 1%. In the Second World War, combining surgical debridement with penicillin dropped the rate further still. Bacterial pneumonia, which had killed roughly 18% of hospitalized military patients in the First World War, fell to under 1% mortality in the Second. Estimates of the total lives saved by penicillin during the Second World War range from 200,000 to 300,000. Tens of thousands of amputations for advancing infections were avoided. The scale of that change is easier to grasp with a single number. In the First World War, roughly 30% of all combat deaths were caused not by enemy weapons directly, but by wound, infection, and disease. By the Second World War, thanks to sulfur drugs and then penicillin, that proportion had fallen dramatically. A soldier wounded on the battlefield in 1944 was many times more likely to survive his injuries than a soldier wounded in the same way in 1917. That difference was not luck or better surgery alone. It was chemistry, manufactured at scale, on Marcy Avenue in Brooklyn. The German military had no equivalent. Their pharmaceutical industry had begun attempting to produce penicillin in 1942, but by late 1944 they could produce only trace quantities, nowhere near enough for military use. Some German medical officers treated patients with penicillin obtained from captured Allied medical supplies. The gap between the two sides was not a matter of scientific knowledge, it was a matter of industrial capacity. That gap would be felt in a Belgian riding hall on Christmas night. December 22, 1944, began like every other morning in the pocket, cold, tense, and waiting. German artillery had been shelling the perimeter since before dawn. American gunners returned fire sparingly, counting every round. The sky remained closed. No Allied aircraft had appeared since the encirclement began. At approximately 11:30 that morning, a German party approached the lines of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment on the Arlon Road. There were 4 of them, walking slowly under 2 white flags. 2 were officers, 2 were enlisted men. The senior officer was Major Wagner, attached to the 47th Panzer Corps staff. The junior officer was Lieutenant Helmuth Henke of Panzerlehr's Operations Section, who carried a briefcase containing a typewritten surrender demand. The 2 enlisted men had been selected from the 900 and 1st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. They were received by American sentries, blindfolded, and brought forward through the lines. The demand, authored by General von Luttwitz, informed the American commander that his position was hopeless. It threatened the destruction of the town and offered honorable terms if the garrison surrendered within 2 hours. The note passed up the chain until it reached Brigadier General McAuliffe, who was sleeping in his command post at the Heinz barracks. His chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, woke him and explained that the Germans wanted a surrender. McAuliffe read the note, set it down, and said 2 words. Nuts. When his staff began debating what formal reply to prepare, his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, pointed out that McAuliffe had already given them the answer. The general sat down and wrote it in his own hand. Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th was sent to deliver it to the still waiting German officers. Harper handed the typewritten reply to Lieutenant Henke. The note read simply, "To the German commander, Nuts, the American commander." Henke asked through an interpreter whether the answer was affirmative or negative. Harper told him it was decidedly not affirmative, that in plain English it meant go to hell, and that if the Germans continued to attack, every German soldier who tried to enter the town would be killed. Within hours, German artillery intensified across the entire perimeter. Inside the town, the story of what McAuliffe had written spread through foxholes and aid stations and command posts by nightfall. Men who had been rationing ammunition and eating cold rations in frozen positions for days heard what their commander had said to the German general who demanded their surrender, and they laughed. It did not change the ammunition count or the medical situation, but it changed something harder to measure. December 23, 1944. The clouds broke. For 7 days, the Ardennes had been sealed under dense overcast that grounded every Allied aircraft in England and France. German planners had deliberately timed the offensive for precisely this kind of weather. The grounding of Allied air power was not an accident of timing. It was a condition the entire operation depended on. It ended on the morning of December 23. 12 paratroopers from the 9th Troop Carrier Command's Pathfinder Group, based at Royal Air Force Chalgrove in Oxfordshire, had been on standby since the encirclement began. The Pathfinders were trained to jump ahead of larger formations and mark drop zones with radar beacons and smoke signals so that following aircraft could find their targets. Their entire purpose was to go in first. At 06:45 hours on December 23, 2 transport aircraft lifted off from Chalgrove and turned east toward Belgium. The lead aircraft was piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Joel Crouch. The man who had led American Pathfinder operations since the invasion of Sicily in 1943 and had jumped Pathfinders before every major American airborne operation of the war. German anti-aircraft fire found the planes as they approached Bastogne. A shell punched through the fuselage of Crouch's aircraft between two of the paratroopers. Crouch dove to treetop level to scatter the gun crew and held his course. The first Pathfinder stick jumped at 0931 over a snow-covered field west of Bastogne. Smoke pots were burning within 3 minutes. The second team was on the ground before 1000 hours. Both Eureka radar beacons, the devices that would guide the approaching transport aircraft, were operational by the time the first supply formation arrived overhead. Shortly before noon, the sky over Bastogne filled with sound. 241 C-47 transport aircraft of the 9th Troop Carrier Command came in over the tree line, low and slow, flying through light anti-aircraft fire that damaged several planes but turned none back. Their holds contained 1,446 individual cargo bundles, color-coded so recovery teams on the ground would know what each one held. Red bundles were ammunition. Yellow bundles were equipment and fuel. Blue bundles were rations. White bundles were medical supplies. The parachutes opened. For the men inside the perimeter, the sight was almost incomprehensible. After 7 days of silence and isolation, the sky was suddenly full of color. Hundreds of canopies drifted down through the winter air, each trailing something the garrison desperately needed. Recovery teams from the 501st and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments deployed immediately in jeeps, hauling containers back to ammunition points and aid stations. The recovery rate was approximately 95%. Almost nothing was lost. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, which had reached its low point of 9 rounds of high explosive, recovered approximately 1,000 rounds of 75mm ammunition before dark. 82 P-47 Thunderbolt fighter aircraft flew escort and then remained over the perimeter, striking German positions with bombs and machine gun fire. After 7 days of silence, Allied air power had finally arrived. Cocotte, watching from his command post outside the perimeter, saw the multicolored parachutes settling across the American lines and believed he was looking at fresh paratroopers. According to his post-war testimony, given to American Army historian Brigadier General Samuel Marshall in late 1945, the sight served, in Cocotte's own words, to increase the disorder in the ranks of the attackers. He was watching supply bundles, but the disorder was real. The supply missions continued on December 24, 26, and 27. Christmas Day itself saw no missions, because bad weather over England grounded the aircraft that morning. Across all 4 flying days, more than 1,000 tons of supplies and equipment were delivered to the pocket by parachute, and a further 90 tons by glider, according to figures compiled by the United States Army Military History Institute. Multiple aircraft were lost, including 9 of 13 planes from the 440th Troop Carrier Group on the 27th alone, the single worst day of losses in the operation. Inside Bastogne, even as supplies arrived, the medical situation remained the most critical problem. Penicillin still was not there. In the basement of the Heinz barracks, and at the improvised stations maintained by the surviving medics, the number of wounded continued to rise daily. By the time the resupply missions began on December 23rd, the medical teams had been treating casualties for 4 days with no surgical capability and no penicillin. They had plenty of bandages and sulfur powder from the local supply depots, but the cases that most needed penicillin were already beyond the reach of what they had. These were men with shrapnel wounds, packed with mud and wool fiber from winter uniforms, wounds that had been open for days in freezing conditions before the men reached any medical care. Men with penetrating abdominal wounds who had survived the initial injury but were losing the slower battle against bacterial infection. Men with compound fractures, bone exposed in torn flesh that had been wrapped in field dressings for days. For these patients, the absence of penicillin and the absence of a surgeon capable of operating were not separate problems. They were the same problem. Without the drug to suppress the infection and a trained hand to close the wound, the outcome was often determined before the patient arrived. Major Barfield and the medics under him did everything that could be done with what they had. They kept men warm, changed dressings, gave morphine to the worst cases, and documented everything in the after-action report that would later become one of the most detailed medical records of the siege. But the report itself was honest about the limit. It noted plainly that medical supplies, except for whole blood and penicillin, were plentiful because of an abandoned army supply depot in Bastogne. Everything else had been found. The two things that could not be found were the two things the most critically wounded men needed most. On Christmas Eve, a Luftwaffe 500-pound bomb struck Captain Pryor's aid station on the Rue Neufchâteau directly. The blast killed approximately 30 wounded soldiers and destroyed most of the medical equipment. It also killed Renée Lemaire, a 30-year-old woman from Bastogne who had come to the station as a civilian volunteer to care for the wounded. She had no military obligation to be there. She came because wounded men needed help. Her colleague, Augusta Chiwi, a nurse of Congolese and Belgian heritage who had also volunteered at the station, survived the blast and kept working. The night of December 24th was the coldest of the siege. In the pre-dawn hours of Christmas Day, German forces launched their largest and most dangerous assault of the entire siege. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, its 77th Regiment leading, attacked the village of Chams on the northwest edge of the perimeter. Alongside them, Kampfgruppe Mauke of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, built around the 115th Panzer Grenadier Regiment and supported by 17 Mark IV tanks, drove toward the village of Hemrul in what was intended to be a coordinated breakthrough. It was the deepest German penetration of the perimeter during the entire siege. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis's 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment held Champs itself, with the 1st Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Cassidy mounting the counterattack. Elements of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and tank destroyers from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion joined the fight at Hemrul. By mid-morning of Christmas Day, the German armoured column had been destroyed and the infantry assault broken, the perimeter held. Christmas Day, 1944. And at 18:30 hours that evening, a small liaison aircraft came in low over a snow-covered field northwest of Bastogne and landed. There was nothing dramatic about the arrival. No formation, no escort, no prior announcement. A single small plane touched down on a frozen field in the early evening darkness and taxied to a stop. The 326th Airborne Medical Company's after-action report records the moment in plain, functional language. A much-needed supply of penicillin was flown in by means of a liaison aircraft at 18:30 hours on December 25, 1944. With it came Major Howard Serrell, a surgeon from Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army, who had volunteered for the mission. In the 36 hours that followed, Major Serrell, assisted by the medics already inside the pocket, performed 15 surgical procedures. The pilot of that plane is not named in any surviving document. His identity has not been found in any after-action report, memoir, or post-war history. He flew into an encircled town through territory held by German forces, landed on a frozen field in the dark, and flew back out. Whatever it took to bring that plane down in those conditions, whatever he thought about the mission, the record does not say. What the record does say is that the penicillin arrived, and that men who would have died from infection had a chance to live because it did. The following afternoon, December 26th, a Waco cargo glider towed by a C-47 transport landed inside the perimeter. It carried 4 Third Army surgeons, Major Lamar Suter and Captain Stanley Wesolowski, Foy Moody, and Henry Hills, along with 4 enlisted surgical assistants and approximately 600 pounds of instruments and supplies. For the first time since the encirclement began, the medical team inside Bastogne had everything it needed to operate. They went to work on the men who had been waiting the longest. Throughout the siege, one of the most revealing patterns in the fighting was what it showed about the gap between the two armies at the level of supply. German commanders at every level noted the same thing, independently of each other, in the post-war testimony they gave to American investigators. They could not understand where the American ammunition was coming from. General Bayerlein, the commander of Panzer Lehr Division and a veteran of the North Africa campaign under Rommel, told Brigadier General Marshall that he had been stopped before Bastogne by what he described as tremendous artillery and what appeared to be a great number of tanks. The artillery was real. The tank force was far smaller than Bayerlein believed. The impression of limitless supply was partly a performance. American gunners firing with the confidence of men who had enough, at a moment when many of them did not. Cocotte had reasoned early in the siege that heavy concentrations of artillery fire must equal heavy supply, because that was how logic said it should work. He did not know that on December 22nd, the day his surrender ultimatum was delivered, American gunners inside the pocket were limited to 10 rounds per gun per day. General von Luttwitz made his own revealing observation after the war. When his staff learned that the American airborne divisions had been committed to the Ardennes by truck rather than by parachute, Luttwitz concluded that the American army must be desperately short of reserves. Only a military scraping the bottom, he reasoned, would burn its elite airborne formations as ordinary infantry. What he had actually witnessed was a military capable of moving 2 elite divisions by road, 107 miles, in less than 24 hours, at night, in winter weather, arriving at the critical point ahead of the leading German armour. The Wehrmacht had been built for a specific kind of war. It was superbly designed for the violent, fast-moving campaign that had conquered France in 6 weeks and driven to the gates of Moscow. It was not designed, and had no answer, for a war in which one side could mass-produce a life-saving drug in a converted Brooklyn ice factory, fill hundreds of transport aircraft with color-coded supply bundles, deliver them by parachute to a surrounded town, and then land a single small plane on a frozen Belgian field on Christmas night to bring medicine to a doctor who had been trying to keep men alive for 6 days without it. The fuel crisis that paralyzed every German unit during the offensive illustrated this in stark terms. The 116th Panzer Division had to seize a roughly 25,000-gallon American fuel depot at the Belgian village of Samry on December 20th, just to keep its vehicles moving. The 2nd Panzer Division, racing westward toward the Meuse after bypassing Bastogne to the north, ran dry of fuel before it reached the river. Its infantry support had been stripped away. American armor from the 2nd Armored Division destroyed it where it stopped, on December 24th and 25th, near the village of Celle. The entire German offensive had been conceived around capturing Allied fuel in massive quantities. When those fuel dumps were defended, or simply not where German planners expected them to be, the offensive consumed itself. Meanwhile, the Americans, rationing shells and eating cold rations in frozen foxholes, did not doubt that resupply was coming. The pathfinders and transport crews and supply officers behind the lines were already working on it. That confidence was not wishful thinking. It was based on knowing what kind of country was behind them. At 1650 hours on December 26, 1944, a tank appeared on the road north of the village of Assenois, south of Bastogne. It was an M4A3E2 Sherman, the heavy assault variant of the standard American medium tank, known to its crews as the Jumbo. It had been moving since early afternoon, leading the breakthrough column of Combat Command Reserve, 4th Armored Division. The 37th Tank Battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. The tank itself, known as Cobra King, was commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Bulge, who had taken command of the vehicle only 3 days earlier after his predecessor was killed by a sniper while standing in the turret. The column had driven north from the Arlon area through Cloquimont and then through the village of Assenois under fire. Bulge and his crew fired their main gun 21 times through the village streets, while German defenders tried to stop them. North of Assenois, Bulge saw figures in American uniform among the trees. He was cautious. He knew that German special operations personnel had been infiltrating American lines in American uniforms throughout the offensive. He called out twice before the figures moved toward him. A young officer walked out of the tree line and identified himself as Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of Able Company, 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, 101st Airborne Division. He reached up and shook Bulge's hand. The siege of Bastogne was over. 20 minutes later, Lieutenant Colonel Abrams personally shook hands with McAuliffe at the Heinz Barracks command post. Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army had pivoted 90 degrees from its operations in the Saar, turned north, covered approximately 150 miles in 4 days through winter conditions, and broken through to the town. The 4th Armored Division paid approximately 1,000 casualties in the relief operation. Beginning December 27th, the wounded who had been held inside the pocket were finally evacuated. Ambulances and trucks moved out through the corridor Abrams had cut, carrying men who in some cases had been lying in improvised hospitals for 7 days or more. The 101st Airborne Division's casualties from December 19th to January 6th, 1945, totaled 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. The improvised medical stations inside Bastogne had treated 943 American and 125 German casualties during the siege itself. When Major General Maxwell Taylor flew back in and resumed command of the division on December 27th, he was walking into a unit that had held against a 5-1 disadvantage, received a surgeon and penicillin by air on Christmas night, and been reached by ground forces the following afternoon. Every one of those elements had required a separate decision, a separate act of planning or improvisation or courage by people spread across hundreds of miles. They had all come together at the right time. The German offensive continued for several more weeks. Hitler reinforced failure, sending more units into the collapsing Bulge even as it became clear the operation had reached its limit. By mid-January of 1945, the front had been restored, essentially to where it had stood on December 16th. The last large German armoured reserve on the Western Front had been consumed. German officers who survived the war and gave their testimony to Allied historians in the months that followed described again and again the same fundamental problem. At the tactical level, the Wehrmacht still understood how to fight. Individual German soldiers and small units performed with skill throughout the campaign, but their commanders could no longer fathom American logistical depth, and that depth was proving to be the decisive variable. The contrast could be seen most clearly in what each side was doing during the same hours. On December 23rd, while Cocot's division was pressing against the Bastogne perimeter, 241 American transport aircraft were dropping 144 tons of supplies onto the same town from the air. On December 25th, while German forces were still planning their next assault, a liaison aircraft was landing in the dark to deliver penicillin. On December 26th, while German unit commanders were reporting their positions as stable, 4 surgeons arrived by glider. And that same afternoon, a column of tanks broke through. These were not coincidences. They were the output of a logistical system operating at a tempo the Wehrmacht could not match and could not interrupt. When Cocot saw the multicolored parachutes descending over Bastogne and assumed they were reinforcing paratroopers, he was not making a foolish mistake. He was making a perfectly reasonable inference from his own experience of how war worked. In German operational practice, a surrounded garrison fought with what it had. The idea that an enemy would respond to encirclement by mounting a 241 aircraft air delivery on 12 hours' notice, and then land a single small plane on Christmas night to bring medicine to one surgeon, fell entirely outside the framework of what his experience had prepared him to expect. That was the real gap, not just in metal or fuel or medicine, in conception, in what each side believed was possible. The Pfizer plant on Marcy Avenue in Brooklyn, the converted ice factory where the penicillin that reached Bastogne on Christmas night was produced, was designated a National Historic Chemical Landmark by the American Chemical Society in June of 2008. The designation honored the deep tank fermentation work carried out there as one of the decisive scientific and industrial contributions of the 20th century. The tank known as Cobra King is preserved today at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, wearing the markings it carried on December 26, 1944. The Madison Memorial, dedicated on July 16, 1950 on a low hill east of Bastogne, honors more than 76,000 American soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in the Ardennes campaign. Its star-shaped walls carry the names of every American unit that fought in the battle. Augusta Chiwi, the nurse who survived the bombing of the aid station on Christmas Eve and continued working among the wounded through the rest of the siege, died in Brussels on August 23, 2015, at the age of 94. She received the United States Civilian Award for Humanitarian Service in December of 2011, at the age of 90. Renée Lemaire, who came to the same aid station as a volunteer and died in the same bombing at the age of 30, has a street named after her in Bastogne. Every December 26th, the town of Bastogne marks the anniversary of its relief. For decades after the war, the men who had been inside the pocket came back. They walked the perimeter roads. They stood at the Madison Memorial. They laid wreaths at the graves of those who had not come home. Each passing year brought fewer of them, until the veterans themselves were gone, and the task of remembering passed to their children and grandchildren. The memory has not been lost. It has been carried into museums, school curricula, documentary films, and the careful work of historians who understood that the full story deserves to be known in its entirety. The Battle of the Bulge is most often told as a story about courage, about paratroopers in frozen foxholes, about a general who answered a demand for surrender with a single word. All of that is true, and all of it deserves every account that has been written about it. But the full story of Bastogne is also a story about what stands behind courage when courage alone is not enough. It is the story of 14 fermentation tanks in a converted Brooklyn ice factory and the chemists who figured out how to fill them. It is the story of the pathfinders who left Chalgrove before dawn on December 23rd and jumped into an encircled town so that the aircraft behind them would have a target. It is the story of 241 unarmed pilots who flew into anti-aircraft fire that morning carrying what a surrounded garrison needed to survive. And it is the story of one unnamed pilot who flew a liaison aircraft into that same town on Christmas night because a surgeon needed a way in, and wounded men needed what the surgeon was bringing. Wars are decided by the people who fight them. They are also decided by the depth of what a society has built and maintained in the years before the fighting begins. In December of 1944, the United States brought the full depth of what it had built to bear on a small Belgian crossroads town surrounded by German armor in the snow. The Germans looked up at the sky and thought they were watching paratroopers. They were watching something that had already decided the outcome. They just did not have a word for it yet. The crossroads still stand. The roads that made Bastogne worth fighting for run in 7 directions through the Ardennes Hills, exactly as they did in December of 1944. The fields where the coloured parachutes landed have been farmed for 80 years. The frozen field where the liaison aircraft touched down on Christmas night carries no marker, because no one recorded precisely where it was, and the man who flew it left no written account of what he did. Some of the most consequential things that happen in wartime leave no monuments. They leave only the fact that they happened, and the people whose lives turned on them, and the obligation of those who come after to understand that they were real and that they mattered.